Hello? Hello?
The person you are calling is not available. Please leave a short message and it will be sent as an audio message.
I think what we'll see after that feels that we don't very much. Less interesting.
I don't like the last one. Okay.
Coronial is now in session. Please be seated.
I've been asked on behalf of the Walker Lane Robertson family if they might ask 3 questions or so this morning. I don't think that's going to take any length of time, but Dr. Freckleton would prefer that happen first. So thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Georgia Pincus. I'm one of the lawyers representing the Walker Lane and Robertson family.
Good morning.
Hello. So you heard from Ms. O'Neill yesterday, but just following the evidence yesterday, we just had 3 more issues we just wanted to put to you, if that's
Certainly,
okay.
thank you.
Thank you. The first one is you gave evidence yesterday that you regarded the IRT as a very well-trained, disciplined cadre. And Her Honour has heard evidence over the course of this inquest that a Constable Sykes was actually deployed several times, perhaps even by you, as part of the IR team, despite him being a probationary officer who had not completed the IRT training course and had only ever ended up on the call-out list because Rolf had obtained permission from Bowens. Is that news to you?
Yes, it is news to me, I'm afraid, yes.
And does that concern you that someone like that was included in the IRT team?
Agreed. The IRT, if I had cause to call the IRT out, identifying a need for an IRT deployment, I would expect that the IRT team in its totality would be the trained, endorsed team that I expected.
And had you been aware of that fact, would that necessarily have changed your view as to whether to deploy the IRT in the situation with the arrest of Kumanjayi Walker?
So I'm not certain, well, I am certain, Sykes wasn't part of the IRT deployment.
No, but you don't necessarily, when you agree to deploy or when you're recommending to deploy them, you don't necessarily know who's going to be part of that team, right?
No, agreed.
Okay.
I think to answer your question broadly, if I had some knowledge that there was concessions provided to people that were outside of the spirit of the structure of the unit, yes, I would have some concerns, but they'll be concerns that I would address with the sergeant in charge of the unit, and then the divisional superintendent in charge of the unit if I wasn't satisfied with the outcome at that level.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Secondly, you gave evidence yesterday about the importance of Alefeo being involved in the arrest, and I just wanted to canvass with you why it was that more effort wasn't made for Akpo Williams to be involved, because we've had a lot of evidence about how he was really the appropriate person. He was well trained, he had the power of arrest, he'd arrested Kumanjayi before, he was his uncle, he was aware of his various cognitive impairments, and also he knew acutely of the issues with the relationship with Rakisha and the need to protect her. So do you accept that arbitrary line in the sand that you drew should not have only been fixed around Alefeo's availability and perhaps should have looked at Derek Williams' availability?
Potentially. My understanding, and I'm not sure if, reflecting back on what my thoughts were at the time or what I've subsequently thought over the last 3 years, but my understanding at the time, Derek Williams wasn't available, and my knowledge of Derek Williams and the volume of matters out there is such that I think we try to regulate or limit the burden on Derek Williams given the volume. But certainly I accept there would have been a value to have Derek Williams involved in this particular arrest, but my understanding was he wasn't available at the time.
And if not involved in the arrest, involved in the planning for the arrest?
Certainly, I agree, yes.
Because I think there's evidence that Frost actually asked him, to contact her to be involved, and then because he was at the funeral, he didn't actually reply to that.
But I certainly agree that he would have been a critical component within the planning of the arrest, notwithstanding his cultural obligations at the time, which rendered him unavailable at the time, as far as I can recall.
Okay, thanks. Finally, just want to touch on the issues around the concept of after the funeral. Because your lived experience as a police officer, Northern Territory police officer, includes the recognition that it's essential to engage with family and elders to formulate a peaceful arrest plan, and you agree that any communication to Kumanjayi through the family or indeed needs to be very clear and unequivocal. And I'm just... what has come out from the evidence is that there's sort of been a number of different recollections of that communication. One from Frost, where about after the funeral, and Akpo Williams, and then thirdly from Lottie Robertson. So Frost used the word after as meaning any time after the burial on 9th of November. But you said yesterday that Kumanjayi could be handed in any time before 5 a.m. on Sunday. And Williams and Robertson understood it to mean a day or two after. So I suppose all I'm wondering is can you accept, if we accept the sincerity of these recollections, including yours, would you accept that this communication was inadequately expressed and comprehended?
Acknowledge the communication deficit there, yes, correct. Mm-hmm. But my understanding at the time, through my engagement with Sergeant Frost, it was just Sergeant Frost, not with Williams or anyone else, was that there was a clear understanding on the part of Mr. Robinson in terms of what after the funeral looked like. And the reference I made yesterday in terms of any time before 5 a.m. wasn't necessarily the arbitrary line in the sand, but it was an obvious acknowledgement of the fact that we weren't going to engage in the tactical action until 5 a.m. the next morning.
Okay, thank you. No more questions.
Mr. Hutton, do you have one?
I think, thank you.
Sorry.
Superintendent, you gave evidence yesterday regarding the unacceptable risk you considered to be posed by the withdrawal of the health service from Coronial.
Yes.
Are you aware of a document known as a vulnerable persons list?
I'm not sure I'm aware of a document per se. I presume there would be a document, but I'm certainly aware of a vulnerable persons list, yes.
All right. Were you aware of how many people were on that list in UNMU in November 2019?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
Were you aware of how many people in UNMU either that were on that list or off it were considered by the health service to be acutely unwell at that time?
No, I'm afraid not.
Right. In your role as superintendent, do you have any understanding of how regularly or how often people are required to be retrieved from UNMU for medical reasons?
Not definitively, but certainly as a relatively regular occurrence, given the extent of health issues inherent within that community, yes.
That's not data that's made available to you, though. It doesn't come across your desk ordinarily.
No, it may be something that is highlighted within an interagency integrated meeting, potentially so the vulnerable persons list you refer to is something that I'm aware of through the emergency management lens. So if we are preparing for cyclone, fire, flood, disaster, certainly not a cyclone in UNMU, but I think you get where I'm going with this, but that's where there's some actions inherent within the plan that require us to do certain things with vulnerable people. So that's my understanding of the list. But, and so it's regularly updated. So one of the actions that I might have preparatory to an event is review the vulnerable persons list, make sure it remains current, and then identify what our actions are to support the vulnerable people on that list.
And finally, you gave evidence yesterday about concerns for overflow calls, as you described them, once the clinic staff had been withdrawn. Are you aware of whether the police station in UNMU did receive any such overflow calls?
No, I'm not aware if there was any overflow calls.
Thank you, Ryan.
Can I just ask one question before you, Dr. Freckleton, again, because it might relate to something. Just referring again to the SNAP order, have you got that in front of you?
Yes, Your Honour.
That's Exhibit 14 in our proceedings.
Yes, Your Honour.
There are two aspects. The first is what you would expect of an officer who receives this document. Obviously, we can see that it's who it's been sent to, which includes watch commanders, and you're CC'd in, as is Superintendent Vickery. So I don't know, would that influence someone's understanding of the importance of this document, the fact that so many people are included, including officers of high rank?
I think that's a fair inference to draw, Your Honour, yes.
The first page, although the task includes the providing a local presence, is heavily concerned with the arrest of Walker.
Agreed, Your Honour, yes.
Do you, even though that is heavily concerned with the arrest of Walker, would you nevertheless expect the whole of the document to be read and understood?
Correct, certainly.
Under the task, we've got the arrest of Walker and then provide a local presence. Why is the word armed included in the local presence?
I can't comment, Your Honour. It's implied, it's unnecessary, it's not, I have no idea.
Does that have any particular meaning for the IRT?
No. Well, by my reckoning, no.
Dr. Freckleton.
Just following up on Her Honour's question then, Superintendent, does the fact that there is reference to people being armed denote an expectation that long arms would necessarily be carried in the community in any work done by the IRT members on this mission?
I would say that that's a very long bow to draw, but no.
Is this a situation then, long arms should only be carried in community if there is a good and sufficient reason to do so?
Agreed, yes.
You've been asked a number of questions about the IRT, and you've said variously in your evidence yesterday and today that you assumed that their members were highly trained, skilled, endorsed and disciplined. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Was the principal source of such information as to their status that which came from Sergeant Bowens to you?
Not in isolation, but yes.
Did you receive information that was incompatible with the proposition that the members of the IRT were highly trained, skilled, endorsed and disciplined?
No, never, Your Honour.
If you had received information that suggested that there were deficits in the SOPs, that there were limits to their training, that some persons who worked in the IRT were not endorsed, and that there were shortfalls in discipline, what would you have done about it?
Would have actively engaged the command structure in which they operated in to address those deficits and made sure that they were fit for purpose and capable of deployment.
Sergeant Bowens was an experienced officer.
Agreed.
To your knowledge,
Agreed, Your Honour.
with experience generally, but also in TRG and also in his role with the IRT.
Agreed, Your Honour, yes.
And you relied upon his expertise and assumed he would communicate to you anything that you needed to know in respect of the IRT.
Yes, Your Honour.
You've been asked some questions again today about the role of Derek Williams. And Her Honour has raised with you again the content of the SNAP plan. As you said yesterday, it was vital for the effectiveness of that SNAP plan that there be someone who knew Kumanjayi so as to communicate with him, to identify him and to reassure his relatives and him after he was taken into custody.
Agreed, yes.
Did Mr. Alafeo fit that set of requirements?
Yes, my understanding of Alafeo at the time was that he had a very good rapport with the family and Kumanjayi Walker, and such very adequately fit that descriptor as far as I was concerned.
So accepting all the positive qualities of Senior ACPO Williams, was he essential given the contribution that Constable Alafeo was able to make?
No, not necessarily essential, no.
Was there also an issue in terms of the use that could be made of Senior ACPO Williams given his relationship with Kumanjayi?
I don't think I turned my mind to that at the time, but certainly was aware that he was involved in cultural matters and wasn't available.
In terms of the use that can be made of ACPOs and also ALOs, though, is one of the constraints that they, of course, are related to and live in the community with, certainly for persons who become of interest to the police.
Sometimes a constraint, sometimes an opportunity. I acknowledge quite often the inherent conflict, but in the case of Senior ACPO Williams within UNAMU, he has broad linkages to the whole community from an immediate and distant family context. So,
yes. But of course, he has particular linkages to persons within his own close family.
Correct, yes.
And in some situations, at least, that can create conflicts of interest or at least significant discomfort for him in terms of provision of information or direct involvement in apprehensions.
Certainly, and we endeavour to regulate his involvement around those matters.
Now, you spoke to Her Honour yesterday as well about your regret in respect of the role in which Senior ACPO Williams was placed in communicating with members of the community and having withheld from him information that Kumanjayi at the relevant time had passed. Is that right?
Yes.
And you identified to Her Honour that the issues that arose on that night have created dilemmas of trust for the police force in respect of the community.
Yes.
And that includes with Senior Akpo Williams, does it not?
I haven't engaged Senior Akpo Williams, but I'd assume so, yes.
What can you say to Her Honour about the efforts that have been made since the tragedy to re-engage with the Uindamu community by the Northern Territory Police Force?
It's probably a better question for those that operate within this command, operate within the Northern Command, but certainly acknowledge that the senior police officer that took over the role after me, Superintendent Prowse, regularly engaged with the community, attended there quite frequently, established good relationships and connections. We've tried to do a lot more within the mutual respect frameworks. Sergeant Jolly transferred out to Uindamu shortly after this incident, or certainly the next year. She also had a substantial connection and relationship with the community, and has been pivotal in terms of rebuilding some trust and respect there. From a policy perspective, we continue to grow ALO frameworks. We've established, I'm not sure, I think it was after this event, but we've established and certainly grown our Community Resilience and Engagement Command. As I indicated in my evidence in chief, we're the highest represented police, so the highest Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island represented police service in Australia by far, and we continue to grow there. The implementation of the ALO program has been a substantial game changer for us as a conduit between community and police. So there's been a whole lot of a multifaceted approach to engaging with the Uindamu, but I guess the nuance and the day-to-day on the ground is probably better presented by the Southern Command.
You were asked yesterday a number of questions about the concept and reality of payback.
Yes.
There is a traditional law form of payback, which can involve formal, calm imposition of community accepted traditional measures to effect punishment and deterrence. Is that right?
And what I've seen of that is very powerful and structured, yes, short answer.
Have you also seen angry, vengeful retribution on occasions by communities which has been loosely designated payback?
I'm afraid more occasions than not. That's the prevalent attitude in terms of most violent interactions within Central Australia. The assertion on part of the aggressor that it's necessary as a mechanism to facilitate a cultural payback.
And was it that form of spontaneous, vengeful retribution that you were fearful about taking place on the evening of 9-10 November?
My predominant concern, yes, that was loomed very large in my mind at the time.
And can that phenomenon just erupt with little notice on the basis of spontaneous phenomena, triggers that are unintended?
Well, respectfully, I won't go through the matters again, but I think highlighted a number of Warlpiri-related matters yesterday that demonstrate that quite clearly. But it's not, and again, probably not fair to just highlight the Warlpiri matters in isolation. It's an unfortunate, pervasive and reoccurring issue across the territory. I won't name communities, but I think it's commonly accepted that there's a lot of communities that have the same propensity for a rapid escalation of violence descending into chaos, with mob mentality ruling.
And of course, a shooting dead of a community member by police is a particularly sensitive and emotive phenomenon, isn't it?
Certainly, yes.
After the tragedy, were there episodes of violence and damage elsewhere in the territory that came to your attention?
Yes, I was the incident controller for the next 5 days in an IMT established. Oh, it may have been 5 days, may have been 6, but certainly around that period of time. Around an IMT established to address the multiple police stations within Southern Command that were targeted by communities in support of the Yunamu community. Our police station, for instance, was completely destroyed days after this event, but it wasn't limited to Wellara Police Station. There was police stations across Southern Command.
Were there problems at Kintor, for example?
Kintor was one of them, yes. Police had to barricade themselves within the police station there, whilst a group of around 200 descended on the police station. It was quite substantial across the whole territory. There was many locations for the next 5 days, and that was my role to coordinate the response to that.
And was what happened at Wellara one of the afterwards the kind of eruption that you were worried about on the night on 9 and 10 November?
Certainly was, yes.
You were asked about the use of negotiators, and in general terms, I think you've accepted that having persons skilled in communicating well with Indigenous people would have been a welcome asset on the evening.
Agreed, yes.
However, if the situation was that even a highly trained negotiator was instructed not to communicate about that which the community entirely understandably most wanted to know, namely the well-being of Kumanjayi, how useful could a negotiator have been at that stage?
I don't think very useful at all, although in that very narrow context, but certainly the utility value of a negotiator for any eventuality that may have occurred could have been beneficial, but certainly our negotiation capability is somewhat limited within the territory.
And is it the situation that highly trained negotiators are extremely uncomfortable, like the Northern Territory Police, if they're given an instruction not to be forthcoming or to answer questions which understandably are posed to them by persons close to a member of the community?
Yes, I would say so. I've never participated in negotiation training, but I'd suggest that would offend any principle that they had within their training in terms of...
I'm going to take that opinion.
Okay.
Dr. Freckleton.
Yes.
Withdraw that, sorry, Your Honour.
No, that's okay. I'm happy that I don't, it doesn't worry me that you have an opinion, but
Yes.
it's not informed by training or experience, so it doesn't add
Yes.
Thank you, Your
anything to my knowledge.
Would the presence of a well-trained communicator nonetheless perhaps have been of assistance in communicating with members of the community about the passing of Kumanjayi?
Typically not. It's something that a role that negotiators generally don't participate in. You know, a communication strategy developed for the purpose of conveying a death message would sufficiently be something that a relatively senior police officer within a remote community could certainly deliver without the assistance of a negotiator. We're certainly well trained within that space. So,
Is it preferable that a person delivering that very difficult news be someone whom members of the community know and respect?
agreed, yes.
You interacted with Sergeant Frost throughout the evening of the 9th,
Agreed, yes.
and you've described her as stressed at times, but how in general terms was the professionalism of her communication with you?
Very professional, very measured. Whilst I wasn't there, it appeared to be factual and current. She complied with every direction that I provided, notwithstanding some of which she didn't agree with. She engaged me in respectful and robust conversation around some of those matters, and she was capable of providing sufficient contemporary local knowledge to help inform my decision making at the time. So highly competent, highly professional, notwithstanding the stress levels that were quite apparent to me, yes.
So was there any indication that you saw that she was panicking, overly emotional, or so stressed she could not discharge her duties?
No, not at all.
You were asked a number of questions yesterday about your use of the descriptor apathetic in respect of the UNDMU community. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
And it's a word that you regret utilising now?
Yes, it's an emotive word that wasn't necessary in the context of the questions that I was asked.
You were talking about, in that context, participation in certain committees with which you had involvement, though. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Did that include the UNDMU Community Safety Committee that you started in March of 2018?
Correct, yes.
And ultimately that was a committee which was not so well attended in spite of the aspirations that you had for it.
Agreed, yes.
However, do you say to Her Honour that it did accomplish a number of the objectives that you had for it?
Yes, it did, yes.
Now, you've been asked by our learned friend Mr McMahon about some of the other committees, including the CSAP framework. Your understanding is what in relation to the involvement of community members and elders in particular in that?
It's openly welcomed, encouraged. It's probably it's the police's primary framework, recognising our mandate, but notwithstanding that, it's our aspirational objective that not only do community members participate in it, but at some stage we will hand the control of it over to community members. So it's certainly critical in the context of really drilling down onto some of the challenges current or emerging within a community to bring about some meaningful action. It's an action-orientated framework.
And you were optimistic about the evolving role of that committee?
Oh, certainly, it's yes.
You were asked too about the Central Desert Regional Council and its subset of the local authority, which has meetings about a variety of, in effect, local government issues. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
There's limited involvement and invitation-only involvement for police in that. Is that right?
Agreed, yes.
But your involvement, your understanding is that there is significant local community buy-in in respect of the work done by that council.
That is my perception based on the very limited times that I've attended by invitation. When I'm engaged within that framework, really robust, really considered and constructive conversations. So.
From what you said, it sounds as though the police have a significant role, sometimes in convening these committees and frameworks, and other times participating in them. But the most important role is that of local community members and representatives.
Agreed, 100%.
Is it ultimately the responsibility then of government and communities to work toward further self-determination in respect of all of these entities which play a significant role in how communities function and in addressing issues which are difficult within communities?
Yes.
And a role for the police to facilitate that engagement and to provide their informed perspective when asked.
Correct, and be flexible enough in the facilitation of that that the framework in which we're trying to draw is acceptable by the community. But yes.
And do you have any suggestions which you would like to offer to Her Honour about how the police can facilitate the movement toward greater self-determination in respect of how the challenges of communities like Uintamu can be expedited? It's a big question, but it goes to the role of police in assisting the assumption of autonomy by local communities.
Well, I guess the underpinning and first realisation needs to be that the rigid framework in which we operate in is not necessarily the framework which the community operate in and encourage and inspire the community. So I guess we are very rigid in our approach, and when I say we, I mean government, the bureaucracy of government as a broad group, not police in isolation. So I guess that's the starting point. But then the next step, I guess, is broad empowerment, and within that, it's acknowledging the substantial work that the community do. I certainly see, and it's certainly not insincere, but when you are constantly acknowledging the benefits that flow from interactions with the community and they see tangible, meaningful changes, it has a perpetuating result insofar as it encourages and inspires, and it doesn't take much to then from that build resilience, and so I guess that's another point. I'm thinking on my feet at the moment, but I think there needs to be broad community consultation to find out what it is that they think they need, and not what we arbitrarily say is the governance structure that they need to be dragged into. So, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. Our policy framework generally denotes a one-size-fits-all model. There's too many nuances and intricate complexities at different locations, so it's recognition of that as well.
And is it important not to have a proliferation of committees and meetings and bureaucratic involvements?
Agreed, 100%.
Is it also important that there not be unhelpful overlap between the various entities of government which are involved with communities, and that they coordinate effectively?
Agreed, yes. It's also important that wherever we land on a framework, whilst acknowledging the importance of continuing to iterate and evolve and grow and develop, but a framework needs time to mature and be embedded, not sort of a knee-jerk perception that it's yet something else that hasn't worked and need to come over the top with yet another one that fundamentally is the same in any event, but generally driven by another agency.
And is it your impression from interacting with the elders at Uintamu that there is goodwill and commitment toward those objectives?
Not a doubt, yes.
And is there goodwill and commitment on the behalf of the Northern Territory Police Force to
Yes,
those objectives?
And I'd say my Northern Territory government partners that I've had the pleasure of working with in these communities as well, yes.
Thank you for answering those questions, Superintendent.
Thank you, Doctor.
Dr. Dwyer?
Thank you, Your Honour. Superintendent, you'll recall that you were asked some questions about the command management team meetings.
Yes.
And Superintendent, when I'm asking you questions, please sit where you're comfortable. Her Honour's the most important person, so please have a look at her if you will, but otherwise just be comfortable.
Thank you.
In relation to the command management team meetings, you were asked some questions by my learned friend Mr Bolton of Senior Counsel about your attendance at those meetings and whether you recall any discussions of Constable Rolfe. You recall those questions?
Agreed, yes.
And I think you said something like it's quite possible there may have been conversations to that effect, but you genuinely don't recall sitting here in the box some 3 years or so after. Is that correct?
Correct. It's, Constable Rolfe doesn't fit within my chain of command, so I'm sure there was conversations, but I can't genuinely recall if or what the content of those conversations may have been.
And is it fair to say that in terms of the discussions of individual officers, you would have been more focused on those in your command because you're responsible for following them up?
Agreed, yes.
We have on file a statement from Virginia Reid, who at that stage held the rank of Detective Acting Commander and was in Professional Standards Command. Do you recall Commander Reid?
Yes, I'm aware of Commander Reid and her position at the time, yes.
And she was the Divisional Superintendent for Ethics in the Integrity Division with oversight of investigations into complaints against police investigations. Do you recall that she would attend those CMT meetings?
From time to time, yes. Certainly, if it's not her, her team.
In a general sense, and I'm obviously not asking you to name any names, but were there any occasions when Commander Reid or someone in her position would say to you, Superintendent Nobbs, I want you to keep an eye out on this particular officer who's within your command?
It's a collaborative engagement process. So we're all trying within that CMT construct to change behaviours, identify risks. So it's a collaboration. So it's quite appropriate and possible that and regular. That's the CMT PSC representatives would highlight things, particularly if they're seeing emerging trends or patterns in a different CMT, and they might say, hey, this is an isolated matter here, but we're seeing a prevalence of it there. And then we would turn our mind to what we need to look at to ensure parity, early intervention and corrective behaviour.
We can look for the minutes of CMTs, but can you just give us a general understanding of who in Alice Springs, as in what ranks, would attend the CMT meetings?
So generally it's chaired by the commander. At the time that was Bradley Curry. The then 3 superintendents from the command. So Southern Desert, Alice Springs and Barclay would attend, and quite often, but not always, the senior sergeants from those respective areas would also attend, but that's where it ended.
Not sergeants, senior sergeants, is that right?
Yes, senior sergeants. Okay. OICs, not sergeants.
And in terms of the 3 commanders in 2019, that was Commander Vickery for the Alice Springs.
3 superintendents.
3 superintendents, I beg your pardon. Commander Vickery for Alice Springs, yourself for the Southern Desert, and can you recall who it was for Barclay?
May have been Superintendent Collie Proctor, potentially.
Just in terms of Commander Reid's statement, you may not have seen that, is that right?
Correct, yes.
In her statement, she says this, and I'm reading from paragraph 7 for the benefit of my learned friends. On the 12th of June 2019, she met with the Ombudsman. I'll just summarise this bit, and she had some concerns about use of force matters for Constable Rolfe. She says it was about this time or following, so sometime around June or afterwards, that she says, I spoke to Commander Curry and Superintendent Vickery during a command management team meeting and advised them that I was reviewing a number of the complaints referred to me from the Ombudsman Office, where Naja had raised concerns with the complaint outcomes and that it was likely they would be recategorised and further investigated. I further conveyed that I was concerned about Constable Rolfe's non-adherence to the body-worn video policy and that this was the 3rd occasion that I'd become aware of people fleeing from him and injuries occurring when apprehended. I just paused to note 2 things. In that paragraph, she refers to speaking with Commander Curry and Superintendent Vickery about those things. And if I just ask you to recall that the decision of Judge Borchers in relation to the Malcolm Ryder matter, where Constable Rolfe was criticised, was the 9th of May 2019. She then goes on to say, on Wednesday the 17th of July 2019, I was in Alice Springs with Commander Bacon. During the visit, we discussed with Acting Commander Jody Nobbs and Acting Superintendent Peter Dash, PSC, concerns relating to the excessive use of force and officers not activating their body-worn cameras, noting that this was something we had specifically identified as an issue in Alice Springs. To highlight these concerns, I raised the complaints of Ryder and Walker, where the same subject officer was accused of similar actions by separate complainants, and there was some evidence to substantiate these claims. She's referring to Cleveland Walker. The subject officer, Constable Rolfe, continually failed to activate his body-worn camera, and there was no evidence to negate these allegations. And that's the 17th of July 2019. I appreciate I'm asking you to cast your mind back, but does that trigger any memory of that?
I do recall participating in a conversation with Commander Bacon and Commander Reid at the time. Again, I acknowledge what she's saying in the statement in terms of specifically highlighting those two matters, and accept that that may have been raised at the time. But I think my recollection was more around firstly brainstorming what we could do around trying to address the more broader prevalence of non-compliance with body-worn, but also to inform us at a command level that PSC were, again, drawing an arbitrary line in the sand in terms of what their expectations were going to be around discipline for non-compliance with body-worn, particularly repeat body-worn instances. And then from that, I think it was a matter for Superintendent Dash to then start, I guess, communicating some expectations with the sergeants within the police stations around that. But that's my very vague recollection of that conversation.
Do you recall that earlier in the year there had been some emails that went round to officers throughout the commands in relation to the use of body-worn videos?
Yeah, we quite regularly sent out broadcasts through the email system in terms of agency expectations.
Superintendent, you gave an answer yesterday, I think, to Learned Senior Counsel for NAJA about the things that you can do if there are concerns brought to your attention about a particular officer. And you said something like there's a multitude of things, from welfare to remedial to placement in an administrative position while investigated to a first-person management plan, a whole range of things depending on your assessment as to the causes of that behaviour. Is that fair?
Correct, yes.
If this had been a matter drawn to your... I'll go back a step. You understand what happened in relation to the Ryder hearing matter?
Very vague understanding of it, yes.
Just to remind you, there was a complaint made by NAJA about Malcolm Ryder on the 5th of June arising from his interaction from police on the 11th of January 2018. In a hearing in front of Judge Borchers on the 9th of May 2000, well, I withdraw that, in his findings resulting from a hearing in the local court in May 2019, Judge Borchers found the evidence provided during the hearing by Constables Rolfe and Zendelli to be unreliable, contrary to body-worn video footage. And he found that Constable Rolfe and Zendelli had not turned on their body-worn. There was only one officer who had done. He said in those findings, I found that Constable Rolfe's evidence lacks credibility. He lied. He has lied in a statutory declaration about what happened in the bedroom. Nobody can say how Malcolm Ryder was knocked out but him, and he surmises that Ryder may have hit his head while being tackled to the ground. Pretty extraordinary for a local court judge to make that statement about a serving police officer. Do you agree?
Yeah, in my career I have very rarely heard that ever occurred.
And it would be of great concern to you, wouldn't it, if a local court judge made those findings in relation to an officer in your command?
Certainly, yes.
Do you recall any discussion at the CMT about the findings of the local court judge and what should flow from it?
As I indicated, I do have a very superficial at best an appreciation of that particular matter in a broad sense, that some of the highlight dot points that you just outlined, but I wasn't aware of the intricacies, but certainly would expect that the superintendent in charge of who had portfolio responsibility and command of that member would have been aware of the intricacies and would have been working towards what end-to-end response they would be provided in relation to remedial through to disciplinary outcomes.
I just want to read to you something from the Proctor report. That is the overall investigation report that's been provided by Officer Proctor, Commander Proctor, I should say. It's 170 pages long and it's in the first volume of our brief. He says at page 123, picking up on what Detective Superintendent Virginia Reid has said, he notes that in her capacity she managed the complaints against police reports and noted that Constable Rolfe was repeatedly engaging in concerning behaviour, including not operating his body-worn video. She had cause to meet or otherwise discuss issues pertaining to Rolfe's alleged inappropriate behaviours with the Alice Springs Command Management Team on at least 3 occasions. Superintendent Reid noted Constable Rolfe's non-adherence to the existence body-worn and his failure to activate body-worn during use of force episodes. And she says this: no record of any action taken by the Alice Springs supervisors is recorded in the minutes of the Alice Springs Command Management Team meetings held in June, July or October, when these issues were directly raised in by Detective Superintendent Reid. A check of the Blue Team records and Rolfe's My Career profile also shows no evidence or any indication of action being taken. Does that surprise you?
It does surprise me, but again, I can't provide any meaningful commentary in respect to that. It's the person that is in charge of and owns the open Blue Team case is Superintendent Vickery, and equally owns the open My Career plan, although she would be a second removed manager. So yes, I'm surprised that there's nothing of any substantive value within those two platforms.
And you're anticipating my next question, Superintendent. Helpfully, Commander Proctor explains what the Blue Team is and also what the My Career is. He says that Blue Team is when a complaint against a police officer or an internal matter requires some form of PSC notification or oversight, an entry or a job is created in Blue Team. You've done that with some of your officers previously, is that right?
Many times, yes.
And then My Career is the career management system used by Northern Territory Police, an IT system that requires supervisors to engage with their members to assist in career development. They use the system to enter commentary in relation to a member's development, examples of good or positive actions, behaviours, and also exemplars of behaviour that's poor or remedial, where remedial action is required. I imagine that's an extremely useful tool for management police.
Certainly an extremely useful tool. Generally wouldn't be used and contain great detail around disciplinary matters, because that would be a duplication of the Blue Team system, and the nature of My Career means that it's open and accessible and capable of being viewed by other people. So whilst there still should be some things in there in terms of triggers or identifying issues for a supervisor to turn their mind to, it wouldn't be what captures any sort of disciplinary response.
Can I ask you to imagine, just in terms of a constructive way, that this was an officer who was in your command. You thought highly of his tactical skills and you wanted to encourage him within his job to be able to manage those tactical skills but avoid unnecessary use of force and make sure he turned his body worn on. How would you respond?
Again, through a sort of multifaceted approach. It's firstly, I want to have an appreciation of how we got to where we had got to, but and I can't say definitively, but I think it's a product of behaviours that have been modelled and emulated. So, it would be about identifying good, constructive, solid mentors, and certainly I've mentored and taken under my wing members as well. It's about having frank conversations and highlighting what are the inherent risks in what's occurring. Perhaps it's around, again, potentially well-intended but misinformed appreciation of what he does and why he does it. Perhaps there may be such a narrow focus that there's no appreciation of alternate ways. I must concede it took a long time in my career to identify the substantial importance of community engagement, as opposed to what I as a young constable, considered a traditional policing model, which was overt, forward-leaning policing tactics. So, and that's a prevailing attitude across frontline police. That I would highlight, the sort of the erosion of small things lead to big things. It's a multifaceted sort of response, but it's through honest, robust, respectful engagement and mentoring and guidance.
And so you would, in your position, speak to those who were directly supervising Constable Rolfe and make sure that they were being able to model that behaviour as well?
Correct, yes.
And what you tell us there is, in this job of policing, is it the case that you've experienced a number of young people in particular, might I suggest particularly young men who need to have guidance in terms of managing frontline policing?
Correct. I was that young man once, a long time ago.
And what might be the case is that if you've got somebody where behaviours have been reported about excessive use of force or not turning body worn, there might be anything from not coping in the job, mental health issues, anger management issues, to actually willful disobedience. Is that right?
Oh, the list is endless. That could be a contributing factor, yes.
But you need to get to the bottom of it to make sure that you stop it right then and there, don't you?
Certainly, yes.
In terms of what you've just told us about the importance of leadership and mentoring, how important is the role of sergeant in that for a young person like Constable Rolfe in his job?
They're the most critical. They're who influence on a day-to-day basis. They are who I looked up to as a young constable and modelled my behaviours on. They're who, again, sort of as I expressed in my evidence in chief, picking the good qualities of each of the sergeants that I admired as what shaped me today in terms of my policing methodologies.
I've asked you about the text messages, and I don't want to have to read them out to you again on the record. We understood your response to them the first time round, but I've put MFIC in front of you, which is a document with a number of those text messages on. I just want to ask you for your reflections now about the role of the sergeants in these exchanges, starting with Officer Bowens, if I may, on page 4. Officer Bowens was not just in that sergeant role, but he was also the head of the IRT, correct?
Yes.
The head of the outfit that you regarded as operating in a way that was professional and disciplined,
yes.
Correct? If you have a look at the language, it's been referred to many times that he uses on page 4 and the exchange that he participates in with Constable Rolfe.
Yes, noted.
Contemptuous of community police, bush police, and blatantly racist. You agree?
Agreed, yes.
What do you think about that in terms of modelling behaviour for young officers in the IRT?
Well, it's modelling poor behaviour. It's highlighting that that's what's accepted and acceptable, and then there's generally a perpetuation of that behaviour, as I've seen in my career. So, and I find it extremely disappointing for the reasons I outlined in my evidence in chief in terms of. Sergeant Bowens is a strong advocate of the IRT concept, and this has certainly taken away any momentum that we would have in that regard.
And then if you might just also have a look at one other sergeant. His text exchanges appear firstly at page 3. I'm referring to Sergeant Kirkby.
Noted, yes.
You see the bottom of the page there. Racist text messages, you agree?
Agreed, yes.
And then if you have a look at page 6.
Yes.
Text messages where Sergeant Kirkby's saying that he lost his shit on an occasion sometime prior to the 3rd of September. Constable Rolfe writes back, "Bro, there was literally no stress about it. I'm all for that shit. I've done the same thing to you more than once before. I'm always ready to make my camera face the other way and be a dramatic cunt for the film, ha ha, and Sergeant Kirkby, and the Oscar goes to ha ha. You put that together with this Commander Reid. She's raising, she says, at 3 different meetings in the CMT, problems with Constable Rolfe, a pattern of behaviour about use of force, and she's highlighting concerns where he has continually failed to activate the body-worn camera. And there's a sergeant specifically responsible for modelling good behaviour who is laughing with him about, firstly, asking for forgiveness for losing his shit, and then saying, accepting that it's okay to misuse your body-worn video camera, that it's all a big joke if you make your camera face the other way and act up. What do you say about that, Superintendent, in terms of leadership?
I just echo the comments I said a moment ago. It's well below what you'd expect for a supervisor in that regard, and yeah, I don't know if I can say much more than that. I haven't already said it's...
No, it's an abject failure of leadership, isn't it?
Correct, yes.
And it's seriously letting the Northern Territory Police Force and the people of the Northern Territory down, isn't it?
Agreed, yes.
There's language that I've referred to and you have agreed is blatantly racist. There's a particular... And there's also foul language, which I haven't asked you to comment on. There's a particular film that had some publicity last week which involves a gentleman with the surname of Walker. I don't need to ask you to see it, but it involves police entering a house. 3 police had their Glocks out at the time, and they shout at a man, get on the floor, get on the ground, get on the fucking ground, is what Constable Rolfe says. And it's accepted that that was a situation where police were attending a house when they had a phone call that someone was in danger and had locked themselves in the bedroom. Is that language acceptable in circumstances where police are exercising their tactical commands?
Perhaps the context of what that entry to that property was about.
I'll take it back a step. I'm just trying to save time, but I accept my learned friend's objection and the nature of it. I'll go back a step and see if this cures it. Have you seen that film?
I think I've seen snippets of that, yes.
All right. Have you seen that film because it was broadcast, or has somebody directed it to you?
No, broadcast.
You're aware of the fact that there was a phone call to police on the radio where somebody indicated that they were hiding in the bedroom and that someone else had a knife? Hiding in the bathroom, I beg your pardon, and another officer had a knife.
Yes, have broad awareness of the factual circumstances that led up to it.
I'm not going to ask you to comment on... We heard from Sergeant Meacham King that he doesn't have a difficulty with the fact that 3 Glocks were drawn. I'm not going to ask you to comment on that. I'm asking you about the use of language and discipline within the police. That's the reason why I've specifically asked you about the terminology used when Constable Rolfe entered the house. Get on the ground, get on the fucking ground. Is it acceptable now for police to use language when they're using tactical...
Perhaps I won't, and respectfully, if it's okay, I won't talk about this one specifically, but as a broad proposition, it's one of the things that grate me more than anything in terms of this use of offensive language under the guise of it's necessary as a tactical action. And I'm afraid I'm in the minority in terms of my attitudes towards that. It's unnecessary. It portrays us sometimes in a fashion that's worse than the offender which we're dealing with. I see it far too frequently, and I'm not saying this from my ivory tower. I was a constable that used that as well in my young days because that's what everyone did. And this sort of notion that it's and every time I engage an officer in respect to it, they inevitably say to me, "You've got to communicate with the people in which in a manner in which they recognise." But then what I rebut that with is that I've done defensive tactics now 24 times over 24 years, and every single time I do defensive tactics, when we engage in our rapid intent specific and competent training framework, not ever do we use, or is it taught to us to use that language within a impacting verbal command. We use police, get back, get on the ground, whatever tactical action that we want to convey, drop the weapon, knife, 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 gun, 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 things such as that. Never within the training environment do we feel necessity to use the language, yet on the street that's the go-to, and it's, in my mind, it's not acceptable. It's when a constable looks at it, they generally look at it through the lens of the response to that matter, but what obviously the passage of time and maturity for me had identified is that the community see this, it erodes confidence. They see us looking worse than the offender in which we're dealing with. It's, as I said, it's. I'm probably ranting a little bit now, but it's a passion of mine. I don't think it's necessary. It has no benefit. You could sufficiently convey quite extensively and impactfully your verbal dynamic commands without the use of the language.
And I don't want to come from an ivory tower either, Superintendent, but last time I checked yesterday under the Summary Offences Act, offensive language is still an offence in Northern Territory, isn't it?
Correct, yes.
And so isn't there a hypocrisy in allowing police to scream at or to shout at somebody, get on the fucking ground, and yet if that language is used towards somebody else, it may well be an offence?
Agreed, yes.
Sends the message that there might be two standards, one for police and one for the rest of the community.
Agreed.
There is a video that's come into, that has been shown to another witness. I just want to ask that be played. If anybody's got anything that arises out of that, Your Honour might allow any questions. This involves a young person who is 14 years of age, Master, I won't say his surname because there's a non-publication order over it, and Beck's just going to play it to you. If I can just tell you before that's played, Superintendent, this was Constable Rolfe and a number of other officers who were looking for this young person after he had breached his bail.
Custody down the bottom corner near Charles Creek.
Sorry for running, sir.
Cuffs on. You were towards you.
Sorry, sir.
Tony, you're under arrest. Breaching bail.
Sorry, sir. You need to be wrong.
You don't need to speak to me. Anything you say may be used as evidence.
Superintendent, child, 14 years of age. What are your views about the use of force there?
Your Honour, I raise an objection to this matter. At page 35 of the property report, this is the Tony Gibson matter, I take it. This has already been reviewed and found that there is no excessive force, and in fact the matter was discontinued. To revisit it with a different witness undermines that particular officer's opinion and goes another
I press the and I'm grateful. I think it's fair enough that the superintendent understand that that was the outcome. I press the question. This is a superintendent who I anticipate submitting to Your Honour has got enormous experience, has been a reflective witness, and has given careful and considered evidence, and has in excess of 20 years working in the Northern Territory, and has very important reflections about standards of policing and how we might learn from any of the issues that have emerged. That's a child of 14 years of age, and I intend to ask him about the way in which that was dealt with and about his reflections, knowing and having worked with many Aboriginal people, over what long-term implications there might be for someone in that young person's position in terms of their attitude towards police, and how we might train officers in Constable Rolfe's position about those issues?
Yes, so, I mean, the issue is the effectiveness and the appropriateness of the reviews of use of force and how that is dealt with. And whilst certain opinions have been expressed and actions taken, the question is, where do we go from here? Were those responses and actions appropriate and adequate? And that is what we are now considering, and I will allow the question.
May it please the court. Superintendent, what are your reflections when you view that video?
I guess through the narrow lens that you've provided, I concede and acknowledge right from the outset that there's probably a plethora of information that I'm not privy to. But prima facie, looking at that through that narrow lens, it certainly doesn't. It looks prima facie excessive, for the lack of a better term. It's on reflection, I see the small statured 14-year-old contained in a bin. So he was contained. Wasn't going anywhere. Alternate options were available in terms of engaging the youth, advising him at that time whilst contained. You're under arrest for, I think I heard, breach of bail, so I'm presuming that's at the highest what it was, and certainly not trivialising breach of bail, but that appears to be what it's for. It's highly necessary in our mind, whether it's an offender, an injured person, to engage in a constant, continuing to articulate what we are doing and why we're doing it, to ensure that there's no miscommunication, and then the flow from that is potential injury. So as an alternative to what it would appear to be a forceful pulling of the bin to the ground, it could have been, I'm now going to lower the bin. When you come out of the bin, you're going to be handcuffed, you're going to be placed on the ground. When I pick you up, it's going to look like this. So again, based on the narrow lens that you've provided me, it prima facie looks, certainly doesn't look to align with our training framework.
First thing that Constable Rolfe does, as depicted in that video, when he looks in and sees the child in the bin, is make a noise and then slam the bin lid down on the child for a number of seconds before he opens it. What do you think about that?
I may have not captured the noise. I'm not quite sure the context or relevance to that, but slamming the bin down could have had a resulting injury being sustained.
I just want to play that first bit again. He slams the bin lid down.
Right, yes.
Could you just play that again? Sorry? I've been asked to play it to the bin hits the ground.
Got it.
Sorry, sir.
Yeah, Tony gives him custody down the bottom corner near Task Creek.
Sorry for running, sir.
Castle! Hey, you heard what you did.
Sorry, sir.
Tony, you're under arrest. Breaching bail.
Sorry, sir. Don't need to be wrong.
You don't need to speak to me. Anything you say may be used as evidence.
Superintendent, you see what Her Honour asked you about. It's humiliating.
Agreed.
Constable Rolfe.
Yes, Your Honour.
And you'd be familiar with the sound?
I only picked that up then, Your Honour. I'm not familiar with that sound, but it appeared to be something to draw the attention well, I don't quite know what the context was, but it appeared to me it was to try to draw his attention to the fact that police were there. I think I'm speculating completely there.
And then he slams the lid down and pulls the bin over, and the child says, "I'm sorry, sir," repeatedly before a number of times before he's even spoken to. You saw that?
Yes.
And then says, "I'm sorry for running. There's no need to be rough."
Agreed, yes.
And do you have any comment to make about the type of communication then with the child in response to him saying sorry repeatedly and sorry for running and there's no need to be rough?
Well, there was no meaningful other than dismissive commentary.
We know that that child has intellectual difficulties. If that's your dealing with police in those circumstances, what do you think might be the long-term implications for building a trusting relationship with police?
Certainly doesn't lean towards a positive interaction and a positive relationship with police going forward. I often use the term, you can't be what you can't see, and unfortunately in some dysfunctional locations all kids see as dysfunction, and there's generally a perpetuation of that dysfunction from that. So I say to police all the time, every opportunity you get, have that mantra front and centre to try to influence that someone is capable of being something else other than, and you have some value, but it certainly doesn't lean with what I observed just there.
And it's final couple of questions, Superintendent. You said in response to Senior Counsel Dr. Freckleton that words to the effect of there's goodwill from police working in Yuendamu with the community, there's goodwill from the community to move forward, and that's accepted. And it's certainly clear from your evidence how much you care about these issues. This inquest has exposed issues including racism. You said in response to Mr. Suttner there's no place for racism, sexism or dishonesty in the Northern Territory Police Force. Have you thought about where the Northern Territory Police Force goes from here in terms of addressing some of these issues with officers?
Yeah, I have constantly, there's wicked problems here in some of these, and there's no simple solution. I guess my considerations for you, or my advice to Your Honour for your consideration is, there's probably a half a dozen broad areas that we probably need to look at. One is there clearly needs to be some cultural reform, particularly within the leadership space, and I guess what underpins that is the acceptance that culture drives behaviour, and the erosion of little things, whilst may not have substantial consequences, when you increase the risk profile, the erosion of standards and practices have the potential to have catastrophic consequences. So I know that's just a sort of a broad assertion that doesn't lean towards how we resolve culture, the cultural constraints, but the cultural challenges, but that's a fairly substantial problem to address. The second one, I guess, where I could actually provide some meaningful dialogue is around the command and control frameworks, greater in terms of incident response, critical incident response management. So, every year we do our defensive tactics training, and we are deemed competent within that framework, but we don't do enough, I don't think, in terms of critical incident response management and accepting or assessing competence against that, around developing orders, delivering orders, holding briefs, what's the composition of an IMT, what's the interplay across the 10 functional groups inherent within the ICCS system structure. So I truly think that there needs to be some serious consideration to how that links into our defensive tactics, and that our NCO, so non-commissioned officers, and commissioned officers are assessed in terms of their competency across that. So that's a critical one as far as I'm concerned. We need to do more with the interpreter space, utilisation of the interpreters, but probably, I won't say more within the sort of government sanction organisational interpreters, but more about establishing a cadre of people within communities that can be relied on and called upon to assist in interpreting. That's certainly something that's required, and we need to do a lot more within our sort of induction space, particularly with a leaning towards cultural competency as it relates to a particular location. So there, I guess, some of the sort of broad topics that I think needs some substantial reform.
Superintendent, they were 4 issues that I was noting down at the time. There'll be some draft recommendations that are circulated. No doubt you'll be interested in reviewing them and contributing to any further reforms that you think are necessary.
Certainly. Sorry, Your Honour, probably one more. Again, back to the first area around leadership. This is by no way making excuses, but the administrative burden placed on supervisors these days is extreme. I recall as a young sergeant in the early to mid 2000s, I had, working in Alice Springs, I had the opportunity to shadow and attend jobs within Alice Springs, not to certainly not to try to micromanage, but as a sort of someone that can mentor or oversight or provide some guidance. I just don't think that opportunity is as available these days, given the administrative burden that the sergeant seems to have. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but probably doesn't happen to the extent that it should. So, you know, what that looks like as to whether there's an increase of establishment around the sergeant rank to have someone that fulfills that role specifically on the front line, or whether some of the administrative burdens are stripped back to allow the supervising sergeant to do that role. That's something that is worth some consideration.
Are you aware, I can certainly raise this with Assistant Commissioner Smallpage, but are you aware of whether sergeants have any leadership training?
Sorry. Yeah, so within our rank qualification framework, there's, you know, as you transition from the frontline to leadership roles, there's training within a rank qualification. When you go for promotion, they're assessed across their leadership qualities. And we're in a constant stage of development and mentoring. So inherent within the command structure is the expectation that we are constantly developing and growing our talent and on the front line to in a real-term environment, and in an operational environment to upskill them within the leadership space. So that's predominantly where most of my sort of leadership development was achieved.
Thank you, those are my questions.
I'd like to ask a few questions about the video that's just been played, if that's okay.
Yes, it looks like Mr. McMahon does as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. I didn't announce yesterday that I appear for Naja. Young man in that video that we just watched is one of Naja's clients, and Naja framed his complaint, which was investigated by PSC. It was factually inaccurate because the boy didn't say that he was in a bin, for instance, when the incident occurred. The PSC found specifically that Mr. Rolfe should be commended for wearing his body-worn video camera footage, and that the complainant's complaint was inaccurate because he didn't mention being in a bin. I'll put that to one side for a second. If PSC looked at this video, PSC would be comprised of people with at least your level of experience in policing methodology, surely.
Correct, yes.
It's obvious that irrespective of the 14-year-old boy's inaccuracies, that there was something wrong with what happened there, right?
Prima facie, based on the narrow lens that I've been provided, yes.
The complaint led to a commendation. Do you think that was necessarily the full picture?
Look,
I know.
I say this with the greatest respect. I don't know how I could adequately comment on a PSC investigation in its totality, but again, prima facie, I don't see any commendable actions there.
So, no one knows what Mr. Rolfe knew about that fellow, but he was 14, an Aboriginal teenager, as it happens, with significant cognitive impairments, spent significant time under the care of Territory families, and there are significant issues in his life that led to significant trauma. What training do people like Mr. Rolfe get on the job about childhood trauma in Aboriginal communities and about how to deal with teenagers that they're having to arrest for things like hiding in bins in abandoned school playgrounds?
It's, I guess that, if I could break that up, that's probably a twofold question. If I talk about the first part first, it's highly acknowledged within our operational environment that almost every person we deal with, Indigenous or otherwise, generally have a cognitive issue, one or some of the following: cognitive issue, behavioural issue, some mental health issues, affected by alcohol or drugs, substantial and persistent trauma. So the realisation that they are the people that we deal with day in and day out, everything that we have within our policy and operational framework recognises that as a fundamental reality. So inherent in that is how we approach people compassionately, sensitively, with a prevalence towards negotiating and communicating as opposed to overt force. So I hope that answers your question.
It sort of does, but could you give us a few details? How does this training get imparted? I mean, how much training is there in these central issues in your job?
I think you've got a witness to come in terms of training, so they'll probably give you a greater appreciation of that. But at a superficial level, we spend 6 months in college. Again, every module that we do in there recognises that unfortunate reality of the clientele in which we deal with. So every single element within that, whether it's in relation to a traffic apprehension or in response to a domestic violence situation or response to a highly intoxicated individual, that realisation permeates through everything that we do in terms of how they're instructed and coached as to respond to that situation. Does that?
Yeah, that's helpful. And Superintendent, in analysing complaints about use of force, how does a victim's or alleged complainant's trauma, life experiences and vulnerability get factored in to an assessment of seriousness of the handling of the complaint?
Well, again, I consider my professional standard command colleagues very skilled, very competent, and also have a substantial lived and learned appreciation of those fundamental challenges that are inherent in all of our, well, not all of our, but the majority of our clientele. So they will be matters that would loom large in their mind as well in terms of how we sensitively respond to and investigate a matter.
The vast majority of complaints, though, are dealt with through the police complaints resolution process, are they not?
Correct, yes.
And they do not go to PSC, do you agree?
All matters go to PSC, and PSC oversight the response, but it's not uncommon. So if I have, so you've talked about complaints resolution process, just to give some clarity around that, that's generally speaking, and I'm certainly not trivialising them, but minor complaint matters where it could be about a misinterpretation of the law or things such as that. So they then come to me as a generalised sense within my portfolio. I then either deal with them myself or allocate them to my senior sergeant. But within that framework is multiple checks and balances. So if I undertake the complaint resolution process investigation, that is the outcomes arising from that are assessed through PSC and then ultimately assessed by the Ombudsman's Office. Equally, if that starts at the senior sergeant level, then that's assessed by me, and then so on and so forth as we proceed through, ultimately oversighted by the Ombudsman's Office.
So eventually, of course, it makes its way up the chain, but the primary investigation for most complaints, low levels, standard complaints, dealt with by the complaints resolution process, where the primary responsibility for investigating the complaint is a officer in the police station who is slightly above, in most circumstances,
Again,
in terms of rank, the subject of the complaint.
Sometimes yes, but in most cases not. And again, I probably didn't say it, and I don't know what's necessary. The categorisation of the complaint resolution process is done by the Ombudsman's Office in consultation with the Professional Standards Command, but ultimately by the Ombudsman's Office.
I think that's all I want to ask.
Mr. McMahon, did
Just
you
a
have
moment.
a question?
Thank you for that opportunity to question on that video. So I just want to put a couple of propositions to you about the huge cultural shifts that seem to be needed in the Northern Territory Police. And I suggest to you that the video we just watched showed an act of unnecessary cruelty when the lid was slammed down on the little boy, a slight 14-year-old. You agree with that?
Prima facie, yes.
That the way the bin was slammed to the ground was very violent. You agree with that?
Agreed, yes.
Completely unnecessary.
By my assessment, yes.
Completely and absolutely unacceptable to smash a bin to the ground with a child in it in that way.
Agreed, yes.
And yet we hear from Mr. Bolton and from reading the Proctor report, which Mr. Ross, counsel, referred us to at page 35, that the matter was closed after investigation from the OO, which I take as the Office of the Ombudsman.
Correct, yes.
And that there was a commendation involved for using the body-worn video. So can I suggest to you that both those final outcomes, closing the case and the commendation, suggest that part of the huge cultural shift which is needed to deal with some of the problems identified in this inquest already, that the process of reviewing alleged use of force inappropriately, that process itself needs a radical overhaul.
Look, again, I say this with the utmost respect. I don't think I could adequately provide commentary around the Professional Standards Command investigation. As I've said, prima facie, that doesn't look good from my perspective, but I have no appreciation of the full factors considered within that, and ultimately what I presume reached the determination and findings.
What, like, just in your wildest imagination, what are the kind of factors that might change your initial viewing?
I have no idea, Your Honour. I genuinely can't think of anything that could potentially have influenced such an outcome, but I'm not the author of the report, nor was I the person that undertook the investigation, and I'm perplexed as to how that was an outcome reached. But again, that's not a fair statement for me to make based on the limited...
It's difficult to imagine what information you might have had that would have...
I've seen a lot, Your Honour, in my day, and I'm struggling to see what potential additional elements would have impacted that response. But again, I don't think it's a fair question for me, Your Honour. I say that with the utmost respect.
Thank you.
Nothing further.
No, thank you.
Superintendent, thank you very much. I have expressed my appreciation each day. I'll express it again. You have come here and provided your information and expertise over many issues, and from all the various council. It is important information that will be deeply considered during the course of this inquest.
Thank you, Your Honour.
We'll adjourn for a momentary.
All stand. Coronial got now against temporarily adjourned.
Who's lost?
Two lawyers.
College,
Alistair and